Good day. Dungeons & Dragons is a name that is synonymous with geekdom and epic high fantasy the world over. And it is something that I've had absolutely no interest in whatsoever. Really, for the longest time, I had no idea what it even was. I had some vague idea that it was a game that was played with multiple-sided dice. You might have had a game token and you had to do something. And really, I didn't even know what the object of the game even was. Really, D&D is pretty complicated to say the least. Essentially, in the game itself, you don't really have a set goal per se. The set goal comes from whatever you want it to be. But that doesn't really describe much, does it? It's really hard for me to give a basic description of what D&D is because D&D is many different things all at the same time. But in any event, here is a basic overview of what D&D is supposed to be. Now, like in many RPGs, the first thing you must do is create a character. Now, one of the big things about D&D is randomization. Essentially, in D&D, the random number god is king. Essentially, you can get really good dice rolls or really bad dice rolls, and everything that happens in D&D is based upon a dice roll. So when you go to get your initial stats, that is based upon a randomized dice roll. So you can roll good and have really good stats, or roll bad and have really bad stats, or you could roll a marginally good number of stats, but then want to change one stat and then roll again and have all bad stats. Really, the fact is, random numbers god is your god when playing D&D. Now, after you have created your character, you need to go into the game world proper. Now, you yourself can create your own custom game world, or you can just use a template, and there are many templates to say the least. The most well-known template world is the Forgotten Realms. That's the setting with the famous dark elf Drizzt, and is the setting of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. Now, when you play D&D, you have a game master. Essentially, this person's job is to act as the controller of the game itself. Now, the whole game lives and dies, as I said earlier, by the dice roll. If the dice are kind, you can actually do something. If they are not, you'll find yourself either dying or just shooting an enemy in the foot. Really, the level of fun had in-game varies from game master to game master. Some are fun and allow you to kill enemies and get loot and possibly fight evil, or some just make the game really boring, like taking time to actually describe every single knot you put into a rope to climb down a cliff. Really though, the possibilities are endless. Now, D&D has proven to be so popular that numerous, I do mean numerous, fantasy RPGs have taken inspiration and even rule systems straight from it. Even Knights of the Old Republic uses a rule system that was created for D&D. Now, moving on from Dungeons & Dragons for a moment, in the 1980s and 90s, Capcom was a video game juggernaut, capable of making an exemplary video game out of just about anything. Now, in the mid-1990s, Capcom's best games were either fighting games or beat-em-ups. Now, they all pretty much use the same hardware. The Capcom System 2 board was used in tons of great games, from Street Fighter II to Alien vs. Predator. So what do you get when you combine a beat-em-up style of gameplay with D&D? Well, it should be obvious. You get gaming greatness! The game is, at its most basic level, a side-scrolling beat-em-up. You walk to the right and sometimes left, killing enemies with a variety of weapons. Unlike in other beat-em-ups, you get access to several ranged and area effect weapons. You have a bow, throwing daggers, throwing hammers, and a pot of oil. You can pick these up in the world, and you can, surprisingly enough, buy them at towns. Dungeons & Dragons, the Tower of Doom, is advanced enough to have its own currency. You can find gold and silver pieces by breaking open chests and beating them out of enemies. One really annoying thing, though, is the fact you never get nearly enough time to get the loot. If you take too long, your character takes off like the money's cursed or something. And seeing as how this is a D&D game, there was probably at some time a monster named Monblor, or possibly Microsoft. Moving on, the game has a level up system, but it's kind of pointless because if you die, you lose all your experience points. But since the best way to progress in a game like this is just to add another quarter, it doesn't really matter. And surprisingly enough, I always leveled up at the end of every stage, regardless of how many times I actually died during the completion of said stage. But in all reality, leveling up just gives you more hit points, which in the long run doesn't really matter because you regain health by but in Quarterson. Now you have access to multiple character classes. You have the dwarf who can take a lot of punishment, but has a very short ranged attack, a fighter who can also take a good amount of punishment, but has a slightly longer ranged main attack. You then have access to an elf who can take little damage, but has access to numerous ranged weapons and magic. And then finally you have access to a cleric class, who basically combines magic and fighting prowess. The game allows for 4-player simultaneous co-op. However, for this review, we will only be seeing gameplay from the dwarf and fighter's perspective. Now, the graphics for this game are excellent, to say the least. The colors are bright and vibrant, and just look at the animations. They almost bring a tear to the eye. Really, this has got to be one of the most well-animated games on the CPS2 system. And despite being almost 20 years old, this game still looks damn good. With this being a Capcom game, it should come as no surprise that there are numerous moves you can pull off, each more difficult than the last. And this is really one of the many reasons why Capcom beat-em-ups stand a bit above most other beat-em-ups of the time. In a Capcom beat-em-up game, you don't just mash 1 or 2 buttons to attack. Rather, you mash 1 or 2 buttons and move the joystick in order to randomly pull off awesome-looking moves that admittedly do about as much damage as the basic attack. The ranged weapons are mostly useful, but most of the time you will run out of them before you actually run out of enemies, making their usefulness somewhat understated. The pot of oil does do a good amount of damage, but you have as good a chance of setting yourself on fire as you do the enemy, and on some levels they are next to useless. Like the swamp level, you throw 1 and it promptly sinks. On the sewer level, you throw 1 and the current pushes the flames towards you, even though that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You can also pick up spell rings here and there, and while they look really cool, they do very little damage. And the healing rings are almost useless, and most of the time when you try to actually use one, you leave yourself open to attack and even more damage. The music, as befitting a Capcom game, is suitably entertaining and just has a nice 90s feel to it. Have a listen. The level design is also a bit more complex than most beat-em-ups of the time, due to the fact that you have numerous branching paths, and sometimes you get a choice as to where to go next. The story for D&D, The Tower of Doom, is basic, but it is still pretty decent, really. There are numerous cutscenes throughout the game that really go in depth as to the world that you are fighting through, and really this is another game that is big on lore, but short on actual characterization. The basic plot for the game is kill an evil wizard. Now, one might be wondering if you actually fight a dragon in Dungeons & Dragons. Well, you do. You can fight this little black dragon that, while being small, will still kick your ass. Then you can choose to fight a giant Godzilla dragon. And the game even gives you numerous chances to back out of the fight. Just look at this. Yeah, I'm ready. As I said, yeah, I'm ready. Oh, let's just get on with it already. I shall smite this beast from the land. I shall take out its heart and use its scales to make me an armor set of great justice. Oh, Talos, I wasn't ready! Yeah, this is what it's like to fight a D&D dragon. And this is why in the tabletop game itself, dragons are seldom fought. So really, it's just dungeons. And there are dragons in existence, but you don't actually see them. In any event, you don't fight them because they are bloody well huge and have a flame attack that is the equivalent to a tac nuke. Also, they can fly and use the tac nuke attack at the same time. So basically, to sum it up, you do not fight a D&D dragon in D&D, because they are a flying Godzilla, and you are some guy in plate armor with a rusty sword. In short, D&D Tower of Doom is another great Capcom beat-em-up, and is a highly enjoyable multiplayer experience, and I highly recommend giving it a download. And so this is General Lotz, wish you good Planescape Torment, good Icewind Dale, or whatever makes you happy.